Hello there, friends and neighbors. Thanks for coming back to my channel. This is me, Stella Hendricks, and today we are gonna hop right back into true crime, death, and celebrity. The Dorothy Stratten story. It's actually called LA Story in here, and it has so much about Snively, who we hate. It's like half about him, but I just picked out the parts that are about Dorothy. Because those are the interesting parts. Okay, and of course I'm just paraphrasing, I'm not reading the whole thing. Such metaphorical battles were the least of Dorothy Stratten's concerns that summer of 1979. The 19-year-old's career was suddenly spinning like a turbine, and all she could do was keep up. Snively arranged for her to pose for the LaChasse cameras at Chippendales, still hoping to market a Dorothy Stratten roller skating poster. In July, she set out on a transcontinental odyssey of publicity as the August Playmate, one of the rare Canadian beauties to be featured on the Playboy centerfold. The magazine sent her to Montreal to meet the women who would guide her through an unfamiliar, often hostile world of strobe lights and interviews. Elizabeth Norris, the magazine's Chicago-based publicity manager. I met her just as she was becoming Playmate of the Month, said Norris. She was kind of an ugly duckling. She was big and gangly and she didn't shave her legs. Her nail polish was chipped. She was a little girl who had never been anywhere or done anything. I worked with her for a month. When we went across Canada, we started in Montreal and went west. And if you look at the videotapes of interviews she did at the beginning of that month and the interviews she did at the end, you wouldn't believe the difference. Between Quebec and British Columbia, the ugly duckling became a swan. Stratten had fretted over her mother's reaction to the Playboy nudes and was delighted to discover that Nellie was proud of her famous daughter. When they finished the Playmate promotional tour, Norris returned to Chicago and Stratten went back to Los Angeles. I still can't believe I'm home, Dorothy wrote her new friend. It's a good thing our goodbyes were so short and sweet at the airport. I think otherwise we would have flooded the place with tears. Her August 9th letter to Norris from Winnipeg contained a poignant request. I wanted to ask you that when you write to me, could you send it to the Sunset Building, care of Playboy Models? Snively reads my mail, and I'd like to read it before he does. Then, September 8th is also the big Playmate reunion. Do you think you could make it? Norris could not, but 136 Playmates of the month, including Dorothy Stratten, were at the silver anniversary reunion in September. The Playmates each received a new jeweled rabbit pendant to mark the event. A Washington Post reporter who interviewed Stratten at the reunion was impressed by her beauty. The Playmate reunion was so much fun, Stratten wrote Elizabeth Norris on October 3rd. I met a lot of Playmates, new and old. It was so exciting to see them all. Press was there from all over the world. It lasted all day and night. Then I thought maybe you would be at the reunion. I was sorry that you weren't. The letter also brought news of Stratten's improving situation. I moved out of the apartment, she wrote. Now live in a 2-story house in West Los Angeles. 2-bedroom, 2-bath, 2-car garage. It's brand new. We're the first tenants. We had to buy furniture. We bought a living room set, kitchen set, bedroom set, water bed, decorations for the walls. We also have a real fireplace. And last but not least, we got a loan, and this week we're buying a Mercedes 450 SE 1974. It looks brand new. It just had a $2,400 paint job done to it. So once again, I'm broke, but it sure feels good to own some things. Snively, who was cashing most of the checks that David Wilder, Dorothy's agent, wrote to her, thought so too. We're on a rocket ship, he told anyone who would listen, to the moon. That's a famous line of Snively's. We're on a rocket ship to the moon. And I always thought it was interesting in her Playmate of the Month, layout, Dorothy says something like one of her dreams or ambitions or something was to fly to the moon. So just thought that was interesting. In late October 1979, the Playboy Mansion mounted one of its revels for ABC television cameras. The show, the Playboy Roller Disco and Pajama Party, was a 3-day weekend shoot and offered Dorothy Stratten a small comedy bit to do. Among the guests was Peter Bogdanovich, who she'd met a year earlier. They renewed their acquaintance in the buffet line. With the prospect of a major film shimmering on her horizon, Stratten learned in late November, unofficially, so that Mario Casilli could begin the necessary photography, that she would be the 1980 Playmate of the Year, a title that would bring her $25,000 in cash and about $175,000 in expensive gifts. Playboy also planned to begin shooting a special Stratten feature in which she would portray such epic blondes as Jean Harlow, Betty Grable, Marilyn Monroe, and Marlene Dietrich. Snively had begun to push for a contract that would assure him half of Dorothy's income and property for life, whether or not they stayed together. Managers typically received only 15% of a client's income. Stratten smelled Snively's lack of trust and was wounded by it, and frightened. She had the demeanor of someone who had been hit, and hit often, recalled Roseanne Caton, a playmate who had known Dorothy from those first days at Playboy. It wasn't so much what she said, it was the way she acted. She acted like she was scared of him. I always thought that he beat her. I think she recognized a streak of violence in him that she kind of took for granted. It was almost like she thought, that's how guys are. Her adoring younger sister Louise came down from Vancouver for a visit, and Dorothy gave her a tour of the Playboy Mansion and introduced her to Bogdanovich and his daughters. A new decade was dawning, and it looked as if it might belong to the film director and the budding star. Stratten's low spirits began to mar her photography sessions for Playmate of the Year and the famous blonde pictorials. She cried almost daily, said Marilyn Gabrowski. She'd get phone calls from him. She wouldn't cry in front of us, but her eyes would be all red. They'd fight a lot. Alarmed, Grabowski stepped in and packed Stratten off for 3 days to La Costa, a health spa about 35 miles north of San Diego. I was surprised because she didn't talk about him whatsoever in a negative way. Instead, she asked if I thought that Hef would loan them some money so she could get Snively a ranch, a farm out in the country, if she could get him out of Los Angeles. I was totally floored when she asked, because as far as I could see, all he did was make her life very uncomfortable. To keep her spirits rising, Grabowski picked up a puppy for her, a little Shih Tzu. Delighted, Stratten named it Marston, Hefner's middle name. A week later, Marston was dead. She told me a couple of days after that Snively was jealous of the dog, Grabowski said. I was convinced that he killed the dog. Red flag. Oh my gosh, right there. If she had just been able to recognize the signs of what was coming. I mean, no one, in hindsight, is 2020. I'm not blaming Dorothy at all. This is no one's but Snively's fault. But man, that one right there. Dorothy said, she's talking to some friends in the Clarkson House Roadhouse. Dorothy said, "Oh, I would never leave Snively," Clark recalls. And Luann said something like, "Well, why not?" And Dorothy said, "Well, Snively would kill me. He would literally kill me." And Snively said, "Yeah, I would kill you." And it was kind of serious. One night, the foursome went to see All That Jazz, a new film by Bob Fosse. We came out and we were driving home, Clark said. It was a foggy London-y night, and he pulls down this alleyway, and there's this little cemetery wedged up in between a bunch of buildings. He pulls up, turns the headlights of the Mercedes on this little mausoleum, and we all get out. We walk up, and it's Marilyn Monroe's grave. And Dorothy looks at it. She says, "Wow." Around that area, there were a couple empty spots, and she asks, "I wonder who's going to be buried here." Clark saw the relationship enter a kind of Hollywood eclipse, of a type he had seen many times before. I watch every couple that became our friends go through the exact same scenario, he said. Basically, a lot of the playmates stuck together out there, so you'd get to meet their boyfriends or husbands, and you'd watch the things that went down in their relationships as the girls started moving through the industry. The photo industry, the film business, the agents, all the BS that goes down, the pressures and whatnot. And you watched how it affected the quality of the attention they'd get, the money they were making, and typically, they were outshining the guys they were with. In fact, Stratten shone with special brilliance. Provided an entree by an older admirer at the mansion, she was able to hire a business management firm with a number of celebrity clients to shepherd her finances. Robert Houston, the junior partner, was assigned to her case. It had just been announced that she was about to come out as Playmate of the Year, Houston recalled, and she was dealt this money and all these stupid gifts. the brass bathtub and stereo equipment and lingerie. She had done a couple films, so we set up this corporation and we took her on as a normal client. We signed the checks and we set up a corporation so the money would come in there. Stratten and Houston's firm could draw money from the corporation, but Snively could not. On March 22nd, Stratten headed for New York. The lunar rocket ship had lifted off at last, and Snively wasn't on it. Dorothy was gone, and Snively may have sensed gone forever. In New York, Dorothy Stratten's life started over, as it had in Vancouver just 2 years before. As the Dairy Queen girl had been turned into a famous naked beauty, the Playmate was transformed into a lovely actress with a knowledge of the great cities and restaurants and hotels of the world. A woman who read Hemingway. Oh God, don't read Hemingway. I hate Hemingway. And the Great Russians. Depressing books, you mean. The interlude was, according to Peter Bogdanovich's account, an idyll rides through a snowy Central Park in a handsome cab, quiet dinners at Nicola's, and private moments in his penthouse suite in the Plaza Hotel. The day after her arrival, he wrote, they made love for the first time. The days were spent on a busy shooting schedule in the hopes of bringing They All Laughed on budget and time. Suspect at first, Stratten soon captured the hearts of her colleagues with her rare combination of innocence, beauty, and kind of good-hearted grit. She had a room at the Wyndham Hotel on 58th Street, but increasingly found herself in Peter's Plaza suite. Their affair, handled with discretion, was an open secret among the cast and crew, but no one thought of breaking it to outsiders. Stratten's absence that's not what I was reading. Snively called incessantly once she got to New York, where she would sometimes take his calls, sometimes not, and finally she refused to speak with him at all. In April, during a break in production, Stratten returned to Los Angeles to begin a new round of Playboy promotions, this time to celebrate her ascension to 1980 Playmate of the Year. Elizabeth Norris, the Chicago publicist, flew in to help, and the Playmate bandwagon geared up for a number of events, including a guest spot on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, another trans-Canadian tour. This one would reach Vancouver in time for Nellie Hoog Stratton's second marriage to a Coquitlam. I can't say the name of that Canadian city. Coquitlam. Man named Burl Eldridge. I think that's actually her third marriage. She was married first to Dorothy and John's father. Then she was married to Louise's father, and then they got a divorce. And this would be her third marriage, actually. So I think this is not quite correct. Snively wanted to join Dorothy in her dressing room at the Tonight Show, but she refused, with a little help from her mentor. It was my territory, explained Norris. It wasn't his territory, and I'm the boss. Snively, you can't come in. She doesn't want you in here. So he didn't. At the Playmate of the Year press conference and luncheon, Snively hovered humbly at Stratton's side, but his wife of not quite 1 year ignored him, because he's a dick. The Playmate, this book was, this story I feel like was written by a man, or by a woman who has way too much sympathy for like toxic masculinity. I feel like this story was written back in the day. I think I said this earlier before, but it keeps popping up and it bugs me a little. That, you know how like all the attention gets put on Ted Bundy and not on his victims? Oh, he's the fascinating one. No, he's not. Just like Snively is not the fascinating one in this story. It's Dorothy. But like half of this is talking about Snively's psychology and his history and like excusing his behavior. So I'm not a humongous fan of the author of this, but it gives you tons of great information. So let us press forward. Press forward, Saints. The Playmate publicity tour rescued Stratten from him for a time. On their last trip across Canada, Norris and Stratten scarcely talked of Snively. On this one day, they talked of little else. She wanted to be away from him, recalled Norris, and she didn't want to hurt him. He would call and call and call all the time. One weekend, Norris remembered, Stratten traveled to New York for a rendezvous with an unnamed man. When she returned, all her demons had flown. She came in and did a little backward somersault onto the bed, and she said when she got to New York that she knocked on the door of his hotel room, and he came to the door and took her in his arms and just held her for the longest time, standing in the doorway. She thought that was just the ultimate. Then the phone rang and I picked it up and I said, I don't know who you are, but thank you for making Dorothy so happy. See, that is why I like the character of Peter Bogdanovich in this story. He seems like a pretty okay guy for most of this story. In fact, things like that, and you want Dorothy to be happy so badly, they really make you love him or want to love him. And it's so unfortunate that Peter decides to be such a scumbag later on down the line and just destroy that part of Dorothy's story. So thanks for smearing Dorothy's story even farther, Peter Bogdanovich. Ugh, I despise him. Between them, the two women drafted a letter to Snively. It used a poetic metaphor of a caged bird to urge him to give her more room, to let her test her wings alone. They sent it by courier, and then Stratten waited nervously for Snively's response. When he got it, North said, he exploded over the phone. He went into a rage. Then either he hung up or she hung up on him, and she was very shaken. The press loved her. She was very sweet, wrote one Vancouver columnist, and I don't think she particularly liked the little odd beat of fear or something like it that she inspired in the men whose heads she turned, though she was canny about it. That is exactly what it is. That is the vagina envy or the woman envy that so many men have, that odd little beat of fear or something that your beauty inspires. Yeah, it's like FOMO. They see these beautiful women and they know that they can never have her and that they will never attract that same kind of sexual attention that she is doing right there. So it gives them, I think, these toxic male types so much FOMO. There were a lot more toxic males in the 70s than there are today. Which is great, which is good. Snively skulked around the sidelines of his wife's confident celebrity. He would say things like, oh, she's only going to do this for a short time, and then we're going to start making movies together. I've got so many plans for her. We're together, and Dorothy doesn't really like this anymore. She just wants to get away from it. She's not really happy. She's just doing this so we can make some money, and we can get away and do things on our own. In my mind, I was thinking, man, you're a dreamer. In June 1980, a letter arrived from Stratten expressing her wish to live separately. He came over with a Dear John letter, remembered Max Baer Jr., who I love, he is such a character, and said, what should I do? And I said, hey, I told you, man, you treat her like crap and you bring her here and I said you're gonna blow it. I told you to take her back to goddamn Vancouver. He said, what am I gonna do? I said, hey, Buster, I have no idea. You're the one who blew it. And he read me the letter. He was sitting on the sofa crying. Dorothy Stratten's career seemed buoyant beyond anyone's dreams. With the filming of They All Laugh nearing completion, she had begun to think of a modeling career when her Playboy contract expired in June 1981. So she's still working on that roller skating poster, and the roller skating poster people are coming over trying to find her in New York. She's not at her hotel, so they know where she is, though. She's at Bogdanovich's hotel, so they go over there. We took the do not disturb sign off and knocked on the door, Susan Lachasse testified later in a deposition. Dorothy comes. She was probably just woken up because her eyes were all red and she had a man's bathrobe on, and she says, "What are you guys doing here?" She couldn't ask them in. There were others in the room, but she talked to them in the hall for a minute. She was kind of scared, said Lachasse. We all sat in the hall on the floor talking, and we showed her the picture. According to Lachasse, Stratten liked the poster shot, but asked if she could take it inside for a moment. At first she thought it was wonderful, said Lachasse, but each time Dorothy went back into the room, she came out a little less certain. Yeah, because Peter Bogdanovich had already started his campaign of slut-shaming against her, and like reshaping her into who he wanted her to be, and getting her to be nice and ashamed of her youthful sexiness, and telling her how she didn't need to do this cheap roller skating poster. And he was like immediately teaching her how to be a snob. Ugh. And slut shaming the absolute fuck out of her. Okay, you guys know what I think about him. You guys know. Marilyn Grabowski, who'd spent 2 years avoiding Snively, in whom she sensed something evil. One night at the mansion, when Snively lined up for the buffet table, she asked him to eat with her. I felt guilty because everyone was on Dorothy's bandwagon, she recalled, but Snively immediately launched into his tirade. They had drugged her. They were holding her against her will. They wouldn't let her take his calls. They wouldn't let him see her. Snively was going beyond any rational behavior that night, Grabowski said. Without saying I knew anything of what Dorothy was doing with Peter, I said, she's probably very busy. She doesn't want the disruption. You've had lots of fights and haven't gotten along very well. It's time you put some positive energy into your own life. Snively didn't listen. He just kept carrying on like that, mildly delusional. He didn't raise his voice. I recognized that this was something more because I had come from an abusive family situation. My first thought was that she'd see him and he'd hit her, or he'd start working on her mind and upset her. He certainly would not let her take things lightly. I was very concerned about it. Later, Grabowski tried to communicate her fears to Stratten. I described everything I could in great detail so she knew, but she didn't want to. It was that kind of fairy tale existence. I don't think she dealt with reality very well. On the advice of his attorney, Snively tried to show Dorothy a new him. It was their first meeting since the Vancouver trip in May. The Queen was coming back, he told everyone. The luncheon had to be just right. Patty Lauerman cleaned the house for them, and Snively bought flowers, chilled a bottle of champagne, put on a fawn-colored 3-piece suit. The idea was to remind her of how comfortable life with him could be. He imagined how she would dress up for him, and how they would work their way towards a reconciliation. Dorothy arrived in casual clothes, however, and ignored the champagne. Their meeting was merely civil. Over lunch, she told him that it was time they reached a settlement. When she left, she didn't take the flowers. Snively was baffled, according to Lauerman. He'd done what his lawyer had told him to do, and it hadn't worked. 2 days later, Dorothy, with her little sister Louise, went to the Mojave Desert on a 2-day shoot for a sunglasses ad. Meanwhile, Stratten was back from the desert, happy and in love. She and Louise Hoog Stratten were Marilyn Grabowski's luncheon guests at La Dome in Beverly Hills on August 13th, and the editor found Stratten especially luminous that day. Things were going well. The famous blondes pictorial had been laid out, and Stratten liked it. She was going to see Bob Houston the next day to talk about reaching a settlement with Snively. She thought, she told Grabowski, they would be able to part as friends. On Friday, she was supposed to meet with the producer of another film, The Last Desperado, and she was scheduled to appear as a guest on The Merv Griffin Show. Her new life beckoned. But Dorothy Stratten had said nothing about another appointment that she'd made by telephone from the Mojave. She'd agreed to meet Snively at the house on Clarkson Road the next day, August 14th. All right, that is going to be it for this section. I think we will have just one more after this. I'm trying to keep them between 20 and 30 minutes. So thanks very much for stopping by to talk more Dorothy Stratten and Playboy, Playmates, all that kind of stuff with me. And I will catch you on the flip side, I guess. We'll hop right into the next one. Thanks. Bye.